Lisa, at a time of straitened budgets, now you're hearing bipartisan calls for getting out of Afghanistan sooner rather than later.
Yeah, first I want to address the point that he made about threats coming from all over the world. Again, I would come back to the point that most of the major threats that the U.S. is facing are coming out of Pakistan's tribal areas bordering Afghanistan. So again, the problem remains, the top problem remains in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I realize that Yemen also faces a problem, and we have to deal with that. But I don't think we should underestimate the fact that the Times Square attempted bombing came out of Pakistan's tribal areas from Taliban elements there. Abdul Azazi, who was trying to blow up the subway in New York City, he was an Afghan coming out of these tribal areas. So we still have a major terrorist threat coming out of the Pakistan-Afghanistan theater. The point about now there is bipartisan support for withdrawing. Unfortunately, I think this is partly due to a lack of leadership on this issue. I recognize the American public is becoming war weary. They look at this and say, we've been there 10 years. They're faced with economic problems at home. But the fact is, if President Obama explains why we're there, I think the American people would understand. In 2009, if you remember, we had about a 3-month deliberation period where the administration was trying to figure out where it would go on Afghanistan. As soon as President Obama made his speech at West Point in December 2009 and had a plan for what the U.S. would do in Afghanistan, public support for the war went up. So I think war is difficult, and it takes strong leadership to explain, what's at stake for the American people. And unfortunately, this administration has not done a particularly good job of explaining that to the American people. And one last point on the whole cost issue. We have withdrawn, I think close to 150,000 troops from Iraq. Those are savings. So nobody's talking about the savings that have come from withdrawing the troops from Iraq. We have 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. That still is not the level that we had in Iraq for many, many years. So again, I come back to the point that we have in the past shortchanged Afghanistan. We have not provided the resources that are necessary. It's only been in the last couple of years, and we just need to give the strategy a bit more time, not forever, but a couple of more years to maintain stability there so that we can be safe here in the U.S.
Christopher?
Well, first of all, the war in Iraq was sold to the American people as a counterterrorism mission, but we now know that it had nothing whatsoever to do with terrorism. If anything, it made our problem worse. So all the money that was spent on Iraq was poorly spent. That, I think, most Americans agree with. In fact, 3/4 of Americans now think the war in Iraq was a mistake. I disagree that the president has failed to, it's a failure of leadership on the part of the president to not explain to the American people. Because if he were to honestly explain to the American people what 100,000 troops are doing in Afghanistan, which is not hunting al-Qaeda, but trying to build a functioning nation state, he would lose popular support, not rally public support. Americans are opposed to nation building, except when it's nation building here at home. They understand that you don't need to engage in nation building to fight terrorism. The fact that Osama bin Laden was killed not in a failed state, not in a distant tribal region, but in a suburb of a major Pakistani city demonstrates that you don't need to build a functioning nation state to kill terrorists. And that's what we could continue to do with a far smaller presence in Afghanistan. We could continue to put pressure on al-Qaeda, which we've been doing for the last 10 years, with targeted operations, drone strikes, and occasionally special operations forces. And we wouldn't be focusing on just one place in which we've invested a lot of time and effort. We'd be focusing wherever al-Qaeda rears its ugly head.
It's expensive to keep troops anywhere in the world, and certainly it would be less costly if American troops were not in Afghanistan. But a lot of the money that we're spending in that part of the world is going to political and civil operations, going to setting up marketplaces, building schools, and policing roads and training Afghan police and military forces. Would we really save that much money if American troops were not there anymore?
I believe we would. First of all, a lot of the money has just been lost or wasted, or the corruption that is in Afghanistan, and actually the corruption that has been fed by enormous inflows of Western aid to a country whose GDP is something like $16 billion. Okay, it's absurd to think that if the United States went from 100,000 troops down to 10,000 or fewer faster than the president is proposing, that would result in substantial savings quickly. Now again, we're not going to solve our deficit problem by removing troops from Afghanistan. I'm not going to argue that. The deficit problem is a function of all the other things the government spends on, not Afghanistan. It's simply an unwise expenditure at a time when al-Qaeda can exist anywhere around the world and has operated anywhere around the world.
But Stephen, if we were to draw down quickly and create an opportunity for the still very much alive and kicking Taliban to destabilize the Afghan government, wouldn't we be undermining what we've done over the last 10 years there?
I just think that's a false choice. I mean, just to refer back to a point Lisa made earlier, she mentioned threats that have come out of the tribal region. And it's worth noting once again, neither of those threats was stopped with 100,000 troops. They were stopped in other ways. The notion, as Chris has said, that we need to build up at tremendous, monumental costs, a massive, unsustainable Afghanistan state is simply not sustainable. While we've been talking in this hour, we're going to spend another $13.7 million in Afghanistan. We're spending billions of dollars building up a 400,000 person strong Afghan security force that Afghanistan will never be able to pay for itself. There are 150,000 Pakistani troops in the border region. Right now there's 100,000 US troops, there's 40,000 NATO troops, there's 100,000 contractors, and there's going to be 400,000 Afghan National Security Force troops at the end of all this.
And don't leave out NATO.
There was 40,000.
Still, for the moment, there's Canadians and Germans and Brits. And
the reality is we've created a completely unsustainable situation that everyone agrees has a political solution at the end of it. So what we're trying to do is throw more money and throw more troops at a problem that requires neither money nor troops, but political will and a political solution.